Let me say hello to you. My name is Kyle, and I want to welcome you to Uplift. If you're joining us online on Sunday mornings, so glad that you've joined us. We're in our fall semester here at Uplift, and we're starting with a new series called Faith and Mental Health. Faith and Mental Health. And I think it's important for me to say this as we begin. Actually begin this series with a fair amount of trepidation, with a lot of fear and a lot of reverence. The topic of mental health in our world is not easily discussed, and it's often not even discussed in the realm of faith and belief in Jesus. And I think it needs to be discussed here in this arena first. We believe in Jesus. We believe he's the hope for the world. And I think we must involve ourselves in that truth first and foremost, even if we do so without full understanding. Because I don't stand before you as someone with all of the answers. Look, I've read a lot of books, and I've spoken with counselors as someone who sought guidance for my own mental health. I've also spoken to counselors as a student wanting information, but none of those make me an expert in this field. So I hope you don't hear me presume that I have answers to any particular struggle. What I do hope you'll hear, though, through the course of this series is that this topic is important, and it should be brought to the forefront of our conversations, and that we should give Jesus his rightful place in those conversations. So, with that, I want to start this series and this message with a story from the Gospel of Matthew, and it's one that I just can't escape. Let's read it together. I'm going to read it to you from Matthew chapter 26. We're going to begin in verse 36. Then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to the disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, James and John, and he became anguished and distressed. And then he said to them, verse 38, "My soul is deeply grieved, even to the point of death. Remain here and stay awake with me." Going a little farther, he threw himself down with his face to the ground, and he prayed, "My Father, if possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not what I will, but what you will." Then he came to the disciples, and he found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, couldn't you stay awake with me for 1 hour? Stay awake and pray that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Verse 42, Jesus went away a second time, and he prayed, "My Father, if this cup cannot be taken away, unless I drink it, your will must be done." Jesus came again, and he found Peter, James, and John sleeping. They couldn't keep their eyes open. So leaving them again, he went away, and he prayed for the third time, saying the same thing once more. And then he came to the disciples, and he said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour is approaching, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners." Now, I have to say, at the end of that story, I got a confession. I have some pretty horrible memories of sitting through sermons based on this passage. Not gonna lie to you. Countless preachers have highlighted the differences between Jesus and Peter and James and John. And I have what I think is a core memory of being told that God requires hard things from us. And that these three guys couldn't even stay awake the night before Jesus' crucifixion. And I have to admit that I agree. I remember agreeing with that statement. I mean, these are the pillars of Christian faith, right? Peter, James, and John. They were miserable failures here, as the story's told. Jesus prayed just a small distance from them. He had sweat drops of blood. He feared for the pain that he was about to receive. And these three guys fell asleep. He's about to be crucified. They take a nap. And that's how I've been taught of this story. But I also remember not agreeing with that teaching because something didn't feel quite right to me. I remember longing for someone to tell me the truth of this story, and I still long for that, I have to admit, because the story, through messages like that, really highlighted the core tenet of fundamentalism, that there are things we should do if we truly believe. Should do, truly believe. Those are trigger words now. I know that. And I'm not standing here saying we don't have obligations. We follow Jesus. That logically assumes that there are lifestyle changes that happen. There are some things we should do. And there are some things we should avoid. But I still can't escape this particular scene in the Gospel of Matthew. And let me tell you why. Really, for the core reason that Matthew could have chosen to have kept this episode out of his gospel. He didn't have to put this in here. Or he could have just mentioned the prayer of Jesus without mentioning the sleepy disciples. Instead, though, he put the whole thing in here. Jesus actually asked these disciples to stay awake. They really failed, and they slept. What makes the inclusion of this story so necessary for Matthew, though, is that 2 chapters earlier, Jesus counseled his followers to keep a wakeful posture. I want to show you this. Matthew chapter 24, verse 42, Jesus said this, stay alert. Chapter later, Matthew chapter 25, verse 12, Jesus said this, same thing, stay alert, stay alert. So in the Garden of Gethsemane, in chapter 26, when he asked his disciples to stay alert while he prayed, they couldn't. They couldn't. They failed, and their failure really is still the course of most commentators and scholars. That's the course these guys and ladies take when talking about this episode of Jesus in his inner circle. And you have to admit, it's not wrong. I mean, these 3 guys, you have to admit what they've seen up until this point. They've seen, at least in the Gospel of Matthew, the transfiguration. They've seen something spectacular. They've witnessed an event that had never happened before in history, and they saw, these 3 guys, saw with their eyes Moses and Elijah. Saw it. It's easy to think that if they had seen something so spectacular, that they could have stayed awake. Empires, governments, authorities were not kind to guards who fell asleep either. Guards who fell asleep while on duty and allowed enemies into cities were brutally punished. I tell you that because one prominent New Testament scholar who wrote a commentary on this gospel makes a specific connection to these disciples and the sleeping guards of history, and writes that these disciples failed Jesus because they couldn't stay awake, because this was the night of all nights. They should have, there's those words again, they should have stayed awake. This was the night of the annual Passover dinner, by the way. Jewish people all over the world shared a ritual meal and enjoyed ritual things that happened. There were traditions to keep. There were conversations about God's redemptive acts. There were songs, fellowship. It was a party. It was a party. These things were planned, were part of culture. These guys experienced this every Passover night for their entire lives. They've done it their entire lives. But the disciples on this particular Passover night slept. Let me give you a quote according to one of these scholars who wrote a commentary on this gospel. This is a direct quote. Staying awake on this one night was a test, as in initiatory rituals in many cultures. The disciples, they failed it. They failed it. That respected scholar believes this moment to possibly be a test. And to that perspective, I say fine. I've got no axe to grind here, but here's what I know. I would have fallen asleep. I would have fallen asleep. Let me tell you why. There's no apparent threat here in this story. These guys have no way to know that Jesus is about to be arrested. For all they know, this is a variance on their regular Passover traditions. They're eager to follow their rabbi into new ways of celebration and commemoration. And I draw our attention to this because obviously, there are moments when sleep doesn't come. We've experienced those sleepless nights when we don't feel safe, when someone we love is in peril or in a hurricane. But here in this story, none of those things are apparent to Peter, James, and John at this moment in the garden. Now, yes, before you send me an email, Jesus told his disciples bad things were going to happen to him. Yes. But the Gospels also consistently tell that the disciples didn't understand Jesus' words. So in this story, they're tired and they fell asleep. Now, why do I begin a story or a series called Faith and Mental Health with this story? Well, here's why. Because Jesus' disciples could not stay awake even when Jesus told them to. Now, let me say that again. Jesus' disciples could not stay awake even when Jesus told them to. Peter, James, and John had reached the limits of what their bodies could do and couldn't do on that particular day. And listen, you got to listen. Not even the words of Jesus could change that. Now, let's actually take this a step further, because we can go here. They actually disobeyed a direct command from Jesus. He didn't ask them. He told them, stay awake. They failed. But I want you to notice this. They weren't cast into hell. They weren't chastised. They weren't humiliated in front of the group. There was relational space for them to respond to Jesus' command this way, for their bodies to do that which their minds were told they shouldn't do, and for their minds to do that which their bodies told them couldn't be done. These were three human bodies with physiological needs that did what human bodies do when they're tired. They sleep, even when they're asked to stay awake. Our minds and our bodies don't always correspond to the noticeable reality around us. And that's why I begin this series with this story. Now, I want to talk for just a minute about the epidemic of mental health problems. Just a little short bit of history. So 80 years ago, let's rewind life and culture. 80 years ago, less than 0.5% of Americans were admitted to long-term care homes that were designed to help people who suffered with mental health issues. 80 years ago, there just wasn't a collective or recognizable space for people with struggles like that. Even so, though, one of the very first psychiatric medicines was developed about 80 years ago, and within 2 years of its development, get this, 1 in 20 Americans took it regularly. Fast forward to the 1960s and the 1970s, newer medications were developed primarily to combat depression. In the early 1990s, about 12% of adults received mental health treatment. And by 2019, that number had risen to 20%. More than 15% by 2019 took medication for mental health issues. And it appears through that one little bit of storytelling that once America saw mental health problems as a priority, our culture adapted and adjusted treatments. It would seem then that America actually trended in a good direction, but in that same amount of time of new treatments and more focused attention, get this, suicides increased 35% since 1999. And since 1999, drug overdose rates have tripled. In fact, those two forms of death, there's a name for them. Probably heard this. They're called deaths of despair. What an awful phrase. Deaths of despair. Those two forms of deaths, suicides and drug overdoses, are still, in spite of treatment and counseling and therapy, they still regularly make the top 10 causes of death in America. And a sobering truth here is that even though suicide rates are actually decreasing around the world, suicide rates in America have not decreased in substantial ways, still staying as one of the top 10 causes of death in the wealthiest and most prosperous nation the world has ever seen. It's okay here, though, kind of thinking about this, because you're probably already thinking that. It's okay to wonder about how we actually define mental health issues. I think that's fair. If these rates are increasing, you're going to get to the source. How do we define this? Because the latest diagnostic manual for mental health professionals, it has a name. It's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, or the DSM-5. It actually has over 500 categories for mental health diagnoses. 500 of those. But at the same time, the DSM-5 recommends mental health care for people if they experience sadness longer than 2 weeks. Now, I want you to listen to that for a minute. Amounts of time for mourning that once would have been considered normal and necessary can now be considered unhealthy and detrimental. So it's okay to wonder about how we define this. But the facts are there, right? Doesn't really matter how you define it. America is still guilty for a few things. One of the biggest things that we're guilty of is fostering a culture of isolation and loneliness. We're good at that. Doesn't matter how you classify it, we're good at it. Actually, more than 20% of Americans always or sometimes feel lonely or isolated, and that's exacerbated by a pandemic that legally required our isolation. That didn't help it. Get this, there are more single-person households than ever before in America, and America has more single-person households than the majority of countries on earth. So it's no wonder that a full 20% of Americans, however we define mental health issues, have symptoms of an anxiety disorder of some sort. Statistics matter. They matter, right? But statistics aren't the sole evidence of mental health issues, because the truth is often more obvious than the numbers. Our minds and our bodies aren't always under our control. Like Jesus's followers, we sleep when we're supposed to stay awake. So for our remaining time together, I want to talk specifically about the intersection between faith and mental health. And that intersection is the church. That's where they meet. And talking about this is going to help anchor us as we kind of walk through this series. It's important to note this because the church has a crucial and necessary role in our faith and our mental health, but it's actually a two-sided role. Let's talk about those. First, the church is our help in a world very much in flux. It's our help. It's designed that way. God designed it that way to be the community where we gather with people who suffer and we draw strength from that fellowship. That's what you're doing here. That's what we do this for. My favorite description of the church is actually found in Colossians chapter 1, verse 18, where Paul wrote this, and Jesus is the head of the body. He's the church. He's the beginning, the firstborn from among the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. Paul uses his often used metaphor here for the church. He calls it the body. But in this particular verse in Colossians, Paul places the primary emphasis of church not on our fellowship, but on Jesus. In fact, Paul describes Jesus three ways here. He calls Jesus the head, the beginning, and the firstborn from among the dead. Here's why he does this. Our fellowship, our church, revolves around Jesus, this human being who, as Paul wrote in the very next verse in Colossians 1:19, who was filled with the fullness of God. He's God. And it's his body, the church. It's not just a community of social interactions and networking, even if those things, by the grace of God, they happen. The church receives life and direction from this head. It's primarily a community built upon the only hope in this world. And through church, Jesus is seen and is exalted as our solace and our comfort when things aren't quite right. We don't get strength from people who suffer. We get strength from Jesus, who guides other people who are suffering. That's what's important about this intersection. But here's the other part of the role that church plays in this. And let's be honest, the church can also often hurt in a world very much in flux. But listen carefully, church doesn't do this on purpose. Nobody does this on purpose, but it happens. And here's how it happens, because I've been the recipient of it. You have too. We often hear overly simplistic prescriptions to cope with mental health issues, right? You've heard it. Well, you just need to pray a little more. You know, are you reading your Bible? You got to read your Bible a little more. I hadn't seen you at church in a month. Where you been? You need to come to church. If you do all these things, it's all going to work out. That's heretical. You know why it's heretical? Because that places the effort, your effort, over what the Lord can do. And in overly simplistic prescriptions, they're hurtful. In fact, these things aren't true for mental health. They're not true for physical health either. They're not true for either of those. And actually, they can cause, in reciprocal ways, more anxiety when people realize that their own effort is insufficient. Remember, Peter, James, and John couldn't stay awake when Jesus told them to. They slept when they were told to stay alert. And we need to be careful about that. My hope for this series is to draw from the richness of Scripture and the relationships there and the teachings there as a way forward, and to draw our attention to how the intersection of faith and mental health can be good, to have some fruitful conversations about that. That's where we're going. I want to conclude this message, though, by reading a famous parable from Jesus. And then I want to read Jesus' own interpretation of that parable. You know this, Luke chapter 8, beginning in verse 5. Jesus said, a farmer went out to sow his seed, and as he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path. It was trampled on. The birds ate it up. Some of his seed fell on rocky ground, and when it came up, the plants withered because they had no moisture. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up with it and choked the plants. And still other seed fell on good soil. It came up and yielded a crop 100 times more than it was sown. Jesus' disciples asked him for the meaning of this parable, and Luke includes that. This is what Jesus said. 4 verses later, Luke chapter 8, verse 12. Jesus said, those along the path are the ones who hear, the people who hear. And then the devil comes and takes away the word from their hearts, so that they may not believe and be saved. Those on the rocky ground are the ones who receive the word with joy when they hear it, but they have no root. They believe for a while, but in the time of testing, they fall away. The seed that fell among thorns stands for those who hear, but as they go on their way, they're choked by life's worries, riches, and pleasures. They don't mature. Verse 15, but the seed on good soil stands for those with a noble and good heart who hear the word, retain it, and by persevering produce a crop. Jesus says with this parable, the gospel goes everywhere. It goes on all types of soil to all types of people. But something happens here, something quite normal, in fact, for farmers and gardeners all over the world, regardless of what time in which they live. Seed is scattered, and it grows alongside thorns and weeds, right? Can't help it. They're there. Let's state the obvious, though. Nobody wants the thorns to grow. Nobody plants them, right? Nobody does that. Nor did Jesus indicate in the parable that the farmer tried to stop the thorns from growing. In other words, the farmer's plants, you got to listen here, they had no defense in this parable. Jesus said it. The thorns grew and they choked the plants. And Jesus used the imagery of thorns here as an umbrella to define 3 things. You know, we just read it. Life's worries, life's riches, and life's pleasures. What I find so amazing here is that Jesus included life's worries as something that can grow in the soil of the hearts of some people, as does the gospel, and can actually take the gospel from those people, can take their hope. It's amazing Jesus says that. In fact, this phrase, life's worries, in the original language is a word called merimna. And it has its meaning in the idea of a distraction or something that divides. Worries, anxiety, intrusive thoughts. You know what they do? They divide our attention. Jesus knew this. In fact, he taught this. He taught that as the seed for the gospel is planted in the lives of some people, so is the seed of anxiety planted. The gospel and anxiety grow together, and anxiety chokes the gospel. Now, the surprise move here in this parable is that Jesus says that the power of anxiety is actually equal to the power of the devil. Jesus says this. I want you to look at this. Luke chapter 8, verse 12. Let's look again, rewind it to the beginning of the parable. Jesus said, some seed, some fell along the path, and it was trampled on, and the birds ate it up. Now, this is Jesus' interpretation. Those along the path are the ones who hear, and then the devil comes and takes away the word from their hearts so that they may not believe and be saved. The devil and the birds are the same. They're the same. Just as the soil couldn't stop the birds from eating the seed, there are some human hearts that cannot stop the devil. That's what Jesus is saying here. Jesus gives that same power to anxiety because he says the thorns and anxiety are the same. And just as the soil couldn't stop the thorns from choking the plants, there's some human hearts that cannot stop anxiety from growing. Just can't. And that's why we're talking about faith and mental health. We're talking about it because Jesus did. He talked about it. He knew the potent power of anxiety and depression and intrusive thoughts all too well. But there is hope. There is hope. Because Jesus concludes this parable by talking about the seed that fell among the good soil, and it multiplied in ways to cover the losses of the seed that fell on the bad soil. He said it's going to be multiplied 100-fold, right? 100-fold. Now, that doesn't mean a lot to us, but let me tell you why that matters, why Jesus actually used that number, used it on purpose. A Palestinian farmer in the time Jesus lived could have expected an increase, a multiple of about 5 to 7 times what they planted. If they got 7 times out of what they planted, it was a great year. It was a bumper year, right? So when Jesus says that this farmer gets 100-fold what he planted, what he's saying here is that the gospel and the hope of Jesus defies expectations. And it's more than what would have happened. Let's do some math. There are 4 different paths of soil here that he's tossing seed on. If you get a rate of 5 times per path or per area of soil, that's a multiple of 20. Jesus says that out of one of these, there's going to be 100-fold increase. It's amazing. It blew their mind. They couldn't have even understood it. It blows our minds. And it blows the minds of those who have been choked by anxiety and fear and depression and intrusive thoughts, because Jesus never abandons us. He doesn't do it. He never abandons us. The gospel has power, and the church is where that power can be found. And that's what we're going to talk about over the next few weeks. This is a good place to start. We got more to say. Let me thank you for being here, for watching online, and for listening to our podcast. I'm excited to talk about this more in the coming weeks. I am.